We often believe that we are living at the peak of human history. The long journey that begins with crude markings on cave walls moves through the Bronze and Iron Ages, across empires and revolutions, and finally arrives at glass towers, machines orbiting the Earth, and technologies that begin to think in our place. It is a story we know well, a story that feels orderly, logical, and complete. But what if that story is only the final chapter of something much older? What if human history is not a straight line moving forward, but a cycle, built, destroyed, and rebuilt again and again? Pause for a moment and consider a question that is rarely asked, perhaps because it is uncomfortable. What makes us so certain that we are the first civilization to reach this level of complexity? Or even more unsettling, the only one. We know that Homo sapiens have existed on Earth for at least 300,000 years. Yet civilization, as we define it, cities, laws, monumental architecture, astronomy, appears suddenly and relatively late, only a few thousand years ago. So what filled the vast silence before that moment? Hundreds of thousands of years stretch behind us, far longer than any known civilization has ever survived. Where were we during that time? What did we build? And why does almost nothing seem to remain? Official history calls this period prehistory, a vague expanse in which humans are portrayed as scattered hunter-gatherers, living simple lives, leaving little behind. But that silence is enormous, and it is strangely complete. Because when we turn to the earliest civilizations we do know, Sumer, Egypt, ancient India, we encounter a very different narrative. These cultures did not claim to be the first. They spoke instead of coming after a catastrophe, after a previous age. They wrote of kings who ruled before a great flood, of eras that ended in destruction, of knowledge that was not invented but inherited. Why would cultures separated by vast distances with no known contact preserve such similar memories of worlds that were lost? This is not a question of myth alone. It is a question of human memory. Could it be that we are not standing at the beginning of history, but near its end? That what we call civilization is not a singular achievement, but a recurring experiment? If the only traces of earlier worlds are legends, impossible numbers, and structures that seem out of place in time, are we truly seeing fiction? Or are we glimpsing fragments of something far older, filtered through stories and stone? A disturbing hypothesis begins to take shape, that humanity may have built its world many times before, and that each time it was erased. If that is true, then the most important question is no longer whether civilizations existed before us. The question becomes far more unsettling. Which number are we? There is a moment in every historical timeline where the clarity abruptly ends. Dates become uncertain. Records vanish. What remains is a long stretch of human existence described only in broad strokes, as if nothing of lasting importance occurred there at all. For a species capable of memory, symbolism, and complex thought, this absence is difficult to reconcile. Modern archaeology tells us that for most of our existence, humans lived simply. Small groups, temporary shelters, stone tools that changed very little over tens of thousands of years. And then, quite suddenly, something changed. Agriculture appeared, permanent settlements followed, writing emerged. Monumental architecture rose from the landscape almost without warning. This sudden transformation has a name: the Neolithic Revolution. It is often presented as the beginning of civilization itself. But revolutions, by their nature, do not emerge from nothing. They are responses. They are transitions. And transitions imply something came before. What is rarely discussed is how narrow the margin of this accepted story truly is. Civilization, according to conventional timelines, is astonishingly young. It occupies only a fraction of 1% of human history. Everything else is treated as preparation, as if humanity spent hundreds of millennia waiting for a signal to begin. Yet the human brain reached its current form long before the first cities appeared. Anatomically, cognitively, we were already capable. We could plan, imagine, calculate, and remember. There is no clear biological reason why civilization should have waited so long. And so the question returns, quietly but persistently. Was nothing built before? Or was something built and lost? Erosion erases, water dissolves, ice grinds stone into dust. Over enough time, even the most ambitious structures can disappear without a trace. A city abandoned for centuries becomes a ruin. After millennia, a mound. After tens of thousands of years, little more than altered soil. If a civilization existed before the last great climatic upheavals, before floods, before rising seas, before shifting ice, how much of it would truly remain? The oceans themselves offer a sobering thought. During the last ice age, sea levels were far lower than today. Vast coastal plains, now submerged, once existed where humans would have naturally settled. Shorelines rich in food, trade, and travel. Entire landscapes now hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water. If early civilizations rose there, they would be invisible to us now. Ancient cultures seemed aware of this fragility. Again and again they warned that knowledge could be lost, that ages could end abruptly, that humanity had fallen before and would rise again. These were not always framed as warnings of the future, but as memories of the past. Perhaps this is why the earliest written records do not begin with origins, but with aftermaths. Not with creation, but with recovery. If that is the case, then what we call the dawn of civilization may actually be a re-emergence, a rebuilding phase following an earlier collapse so complete that only echoes survived, preserved in myth, encoded in symbols, and passed down as stories that sounded impossible to later ears. And if history is not a straight ascent, but a series of recoveries, then the idea of progress itself begins to look fragile. Civilizations may not fail because they are weak, but because no system, no matter how advanced, is immune to forces larger than itself. The silence before history may not be empty at all. It may simply be too deep for our timelines to reach. And somewhere within that silence, a record waits to be recognized. Not written in books or carved clearly in stone, but scattered, fragmented, buried beneath layers of catastrophe and time. The question is no longer whether something existed before us. The question is, how many times this silence has fallen. When written history begins, it does not begin with an origin story. It begins with administration. Inventories, contracts, grain counts, temple offerings. In the cities of ancient Sumer, along the rivers that made settlement possible, people pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay and, for the first time, attempted to pin time itself to a surface that could survive them. Among the most unsettling products of that effort is a text that looks deceptively simple. A list of kings, the cities they ruled, and the length of each reign. This document, preserved in several versions across different sites, is now called the Sumerian King List. It is not a poem. It is not framed as legend. It reads like a record meant to be consulted, copied, and trusted. For much of the list, it behaves exactly as historians would hope. It names cities that archaeology confirms as real political centers: Eridu, Kish, Uruk. It presents a sequence of dynasties and transfers of power that resemble the rhythm of later Mesopotamian history. Some rulers in its later sections correspond, at least loosely, with other inscriptions and kingly traditions. This is the kind of text scholars use to anchor chronologies, and that is why its earliest lines feel so disorienting. Because the first kings do not reign for human lengths of time. They reign for spans that belong to another scale entirely. Alulim of Eridu is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalangar, for 36,000. Other names follow, each accompanied by numbers so large that the mind tries instinctively to turn them into metaphor before it is even finished reading. Yet the tablet gives no signal that metaphor is intended. The figures are written with the same calm authority as the later ordinary reigns. The structure remains consistent. The tone does not change. There is no warning, no footnote, no explanation, only the assertion that this is what happened. Then a single sentence arrives, and it divides the world in two. Then the flood swept over the land. After this line, the reigns contract dramatically. Thousands of years collapse into hundreds. Hundreds become decades. The list continues without apology, as if the transition requires no comment at all. A catastrophe has passed, and the mathematics of rule have been reset. For more than a century, scholars have attempted to make sense of this rupture. The standard interpretation is that the earliest section is mythic, an embellished preface in which kings are semi-divine, their reigns inflated to express sacred authority. In this reading, the King List gradually moves from legend into history, merging symbolic time with human time. It is a reasonable explanation, and it may be correct, but the text itself never states it. It does not label the early rulers as gods. It does not separate myth from fact. It presents one continuous sequence, interrupted only by the flood. And that continuity is the troubling detail. The Sumerians were capable accountants. Their surviving tablets reveal meticulous measurement and practical precision. So why would such a culture preserve impossible numbers inside a document that functions elsewhere as a political instrument? If the purpose of the list is legitimacy, proof that kingship descends in an orderly chain, why begin with reigns that no human could survive? Why attach the shift from impossibility to normality to a single event, described not as a metaphor but as a historical boundary? Perhaps the numbers encode a system we no longer understand. Perhaps they compress dynasties into single names. Perhaps they represent ceremonial cycles rather than literal years. Or perhaps they are, as the cautious scholar would say, an echo of memory, a distorted recollection of a time the Sumerians believed existed before their own. The tablet does not force a conclusion. It merely sits in the clay, insisting that kingship existed before, and that something, one sweeping flood, ended that earlier world. If that is only myth, it is remarkably specific. And if it is not, then the first written history we possess does not tell us where civilization began. It hints at where it resumed. The problem with the Sumerian King List is not simply that its numbers are large. Ancient cultures often used exaggeration, symbolism, and sacred numerology. The problem is that the list behaves as if those numbers are meant to be read plainly. There is no poetic framing, no mythological introduction, no suggestion that time itself operates differently in the opening section. The kings rule. Cities exist. Authority passes from one ruler to the next. The world appears orderly, structured, and governed, only stretched across spans of time that human biology cannot support. This creates an immediate contradiction. Either the Sumerians preserved a myth in the exact format of a bureaucratic record, or they were attempting to describe something that no longer fits our understanding of the past. Scholars who favor the symbolic interpretation often point to sacred numbers in Mesopotamian culture. 60, for example, was a base unit in Sumerian mathematics, and some argue that the reigns are mathematical constructs rather than literal years. Yet even this explanation leaves critical questions unanswered. Why embed symbolic mathematics inside a document whose political purpose was legitimacy? Why mix abstract numerology with verifiable rulers without clarification? More unsettling still is the consistency of the pattern. The reigns are not random. They follow a structured decline. Extremely long lifespans dominate the pre-flood world. After the flood, longevity collapses rapidly, step by step, generation by generation. This mirrors a pattern found elsewhere, in later Mesopotamian texts, in the Hebrew genealogies of Genesis, and in ancient traditions that describe humanity as gradually weakening after a great catastrophe. Long life belongs to the distant past. Short life defines the present. To dismiss this as coincidence is tempting, but difficult. Independent cultures, separated by geography and language, preserved the same narrative arc. An earlier age when rulers lived impossibly long lives, followed by a rupture, followed by a diminished humanity. These stories are not identical, but their structure is strikingly similar. Some researchers have proposed a more cautious possibility, that the earliest section of the King List reflects a memory of a different kind of rulership altogether. Not gods, but beings perceived as fundamentally unlike later humans. Whether this difference was biological, cultural, or symbolic is impossible to say. The text does not elaborate. It assumes the reader already understands. What matters is that the Sumerians themselves did not treat these reigns as absurd. They copied the list for centuries. They updated it as new kings rose to power. They preserved the impossible numbers alongside the ordinary ones, never correcting them, never apologizing for them. Whatever the early kings represented, they were considered part of the same continuum of history. This challenges a deeply rooted assumption that myth always precedes history, and that writing marks the moment humanity steps into rational self-awareness. The Sumerian King List suggests something more complicated, that writing may have emerged not to invent order, but to restore it, not to begin history, but to remember fragments of a past already damaged. If the pre-flood world described in the list never existed, then the Sumerians were unusually committed to preserving a fiction with no clear practical value. But if it did exist, even in a form distorted by time and retelling, then the first written document of civilization is not a celebration of beginnings. It is a record of loss. And once that possibility is allowed, a larger question follows naturally. If the Sumerians believed they lived after a collapse so complete that only names and numbers survived, how many such collapses might have occurred before memory itself began to fracture? The King List does not answer that question. It simply opens the door. Across ancient civilizations, there is a moment that appears again and again, a dividing line in time beyond which memory becomes uncertain. It is not marked by the founding of a city or the rise of a dynasty, but by destruction, a catastrophe so complete that it does not merely end a kingdom, but an entire age. In Sumerian tradition, this moment is described simply. The flood swept over the land. No dramatic embellishment, no moral explanation, just a statement of fact, as if the event were as self-evident as the rising of the sun. What makes this account difficult to ignore is that it does not stand alone. Versions of the same event surface in cultures that developed independently, separated by oceans and millennia. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a deluge sent by the gods, survived by a single family tasked with preserving life. In the Hebrew tradition, the story of Noah mirrors this structure with striking precision. In ancient India, the god Vishnu warns Manu of a coming flood that will destroy the world. In Mesoamerica, the Maya speak of previous creations erased by water. Even in regions far from major river systems, flood myths persist. These are not identical stories, but they share a troubling architecture. A world exists. Humanity thrives. Then something goes wrong. Water rises. Civilization is wiped away. And afterward, survivors rebuild, often guided by knowledge carried from before the disaster. For centuries, scholars have explained this convergence as coincidence or metaphor. Floods, after all, are common natural disasters. Rivers overflow. Storms devastate coastlines. It is reasonable to assume that early societies dependent on water for survival would encode their fears into myth. Yet this explanation begins to strain when the scale of the stories is considered. These are not local floods. They are world-ending events. They do not destroy a city or a valley, but an entire age of humanity. Even more curious is how these myths function within their cultures. They are not cautionary tales about bad weather. They are chronological markers. They divide time into before and after. In Sumer, kingship itself is described as descending from heaven before the flood, then returning in a diminished form afterward. The catastrophe is not incidental. It is foundational. Modern geology confirms that the end of the last ice age was anything but gentle. Melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise dramatically, swallowing coastlines across the globe. Regions that were once habitable plains disappeared beneath the oceans. Sudden climate shifts disrupted ecosystems, forcing human populations to migrate or perish. For those living through it, the world would have seemed to drown. But geology alone does not explain the persistence of memory. Natural disasters occur constantly, yet few leave such deep, structured impressions across unrelated cultures. The flood stories are remembered not merely as chaos, but as resets, as if history itself had been cleared and restarted. This raises a possibility that is uncomfortable precisely because it cannot be tested directly. That these myths are not exaggerations of ordinary floods, but fragmented recollections of a global disruption that ended a previous phase of human development. Not necessarily a single wave, but a prolonged collapse, rising seas, shifting climates, and cascading failures that erased settlements faster than memory could preserve them. If a civilization had existed before this transition, particularly along now submerged coastlines, its disappearance would have been nearly total. Stone structures would erode. Metals would corrode. Organic materials would vanish entirely. What might survive are stories, compressed, simplified, passed down until they became myths. The Sumerians did not describe the flood as a punishment or a lesson. They treated it as a boundary, a line beyond which their own history could not see clearly. And perhaps that is the most revealing detail of all. Because civilizations do not invent beginnings unless they have lost sight of what came before. If the flood marks a boundary in ancient memory, then what lies on the other side of that boundary becomes the most difficult question of all. The texts are frustratingly brief. They do not describe technologies in detail. They do not catalog cities or map territories. Instead, they offer fragments, names without faces, reigns without biographies, an entire world reduced to a few compressed lines of text. Yet even in this silence, a pattern emerges. In Sumerian tradition, the age before the flood is not described as chaotic or primitive. It is ordered. Kings rule. Cities exist. Authority is established and passed down. The world functions. Whatever ended it did not interrupt an early experiment struggling to begin. It ended something that was already complete enough to be governed, remembered, and mourned. This distinction matters. Catastrophes that strike small, scattered populations rarely leave behind stories of lost ages. They leave stories of survival. But the flood narratives are not survival myths alone. They are loss myths. They speak of a world that was coherent enough to be missed. Some archaeologists argue that this coherence is an illusion created by storytelling, that ancient cultures retroactively imposed order on a distant, unknowable past. That may be true. But even if so, the question remains. Why impose this particular structure? Why imagine an earlier humanity that lived longer, ruled longer, and existed closer to the divine? One possibility is that these stories reflect a psychological need to explain decline. When later societies compared themselves to what they believed their ancestors had been, the contrast was stark. Life felt shorter. Knowledge felt thinner. The world felt harsher. In that sense, the pre-flood age became a mirror, an imagined golden era against which the present was measured. Yet this explanation falters when we consider how consistent the narrative is across cultures. The same sequence appears repeatedly: an early age of greatness, a catastrophic rupture, and a diminished world that follows. This is not a simple tale of moral decay. It is a structural memory of collapse. There is also the matter of geography. Many of the earliest known civilizations arose near water, rivers, deltas, coastlines. These are precisely the regions most vulnerable to rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Entire human habitats would have vanished slowly, then suddenly, generation by generation, until retreat was no longer possible. To those living through it, the world would not have ended in a single day, but it would have ended all the same. If advanced settlements existed in these drowned landscapes, they would be nearly invisible to us now. Underwater archaeology is limited. Sediment buries quickly. Time erases efficiently. The absence of evidence is not proof of absence. It may simply reflect the scale of what was lost. Ancient cultures seem to have understood this fragility intuitively. Their stories warn that knowledge can disappear, that civilizations can fall so completely that only distorted memories remain. They do not describe progress as inevitable. They describe it as temporary. This is where the idea of cycles begins to surface more clearly. The flood is not just an ending, it is a reset, a turning of the wheel. After it, humanity begins again, not from nothing, but from fragments, from survivors, from inherited knowledge that no longer fully makes sense. The Sumerians did not claim to have rebuilt the world perfectly. They recorded shorter reigns, smaller ambitions, a humanity closer to struggle than to mastery. In doing so, they quietly suggested that something had been lost forever. Whether that loss was a true civilization, a cultural memory, or a symbolic expression of decline is still debated. What cannot be ignored is that the idea of a forgotten world did not originate with modern speculation. It was present at the very beginning of written history. And once that door is open, it leads inevitably to another question. If there was one age before the flood, why assume there was only one? If history can be erased once, it can be erased again. And if civilizations rise from the ruins of others, then the past may be far deeper and far more repetitive than we are prepared to accept. The flood may not mark the beginning of history at all. It may mark the point where history had already been written and then washed away. Modern civilization is built on a quiet assumption that history moves forward, that knowledge accumulates, that each generation stands higher than the one before it, seeing farther simply because it is elevated by the past. This idea is so deeply embedded in contemporary thinking that it often goes unquestioned. Progress feels natural. Decline feels temporary. Collapse, when it occurs, is assumed to be local, not terminal. Yet this way of seeing time is surprisingly new. For most of human history, time was not imagined as a straight line stretching endlessly forward. It was imagined as a cycle, a rhythm, a pattern of rise, decay, destruction, and renewal. Ancient cultures did not ask where history was going. They asked where it had been before. This difference is not trivial. A linear worldview encourages accumulation and expansion. A cyclical worldview encourages caution and remembrance. One assumes permanence. The other assumes impermanence. In the ancient world, civilizations often saw themselves not as pioneers, but as inheritors. They believed knowledge had existed before them, been lost, and partially recovered. Their task was not to invent from nothing, but to preserve what could still be remembered. This attitude is visible in early texts, rituals, and monuments, many of which emphasize restoration rather than innovation. The Sumerians themselves did not describe kingship as a human invention. They said it descended from heaven. This phrase is often interpreted metaphorically, but within a cyclical worldview, it carries a different weight. It suggests that authority, order, and knowledge originate outside any single generation. They arrive, disappear, and return. As writing spreads beyond Mesopotamia, this pattern repeats. In Egypt, time was divided into ages marked by stability and collapse, each overseen by different cosmic principles. In ancient India, time was explicitly cyclical, measured not in centuries but in vast repeating epochs. Creation and destruction were not opposites, they were partners. Even in cultures where written records arrived much later, the same structure appears. Stories speak of earlier worlds that ended violently. New worlds emerge, flawed and temporary, destined to end in turn. Humanity is not progressing toward perfection, it is surviving between resets. From a modern perspective, these ideas are often dismissed as philosophical or religious abstractions. Yet, it is worth asking why this worldview was so widespread. These cultures did not share languages, environments, or political systems, but they shared a suspicion of permanence. They shared the belief that the world had ended before. What they did not share is our confidence. The modern timeline places humanity on an upward curve, accelerating rapidly in the last few centuries. Technology reinforces this illusion. Each advancement appears to solve the problems of the past. Fire is controlled, water is diverted, ice is measured and predicted. Nature seems, at last, manageable. But ancient cultures lived closer to environmental thresholds. They saw rivers change course. They watched climates shift within a single lifetime. They understood intuitively that the world could turn against them without warning. Their myths were not fantasies of destruction. They were frameworks for survival. When ancient people spoke of cycles, they were not denying progress. They were limiting it. They were acknowledging that advancement does not protect against collapse, and that complexity often increases vulnerability rather than reducing it. This is where the modern and ancient views begin to collide. If history truly moves in cycles, then progress is not a guarantee. It is a phase. And phases end. The idea that we might not be the first advanced civilization is unsettling enough, but the cyclical view introduces a deeper discomfort. It suggests that being advanced does not make a civilization exceptional. It makes it temporary. In several ancient traditions, the idea of cyclical time is not implied. It is stated outright, described with a precision that feels almost mathematical. These cultures did not merely believe that history could repeat. They believed it must. In ancient India, time was divided into vast epochs known as yugas. 4 ages formed a complete cycle, each one shorter and more degraded than the last. The first age was marked by harmony and longevity. The final age, our own, according to the tradition, was defined by fragmentation, conflict, and the loss of knowledge. When the cycle reached its end, destruction followed. Fire, water, or upheaval erased what remained, and the sequence began again. Not as punishment, but as inevitability. Across the ocean, the Aztecs preserved a strikingly similar framework. They believed the world had been created and destroyed multiple times before the present age. Each era, or sun, ended in catastrophe, one by jaguars, another by wind, another by fire, another by flood. Humanity survived only because fragments endured. The current world was not the first, It was the fifth, and it too would fall.
What is notable is not the dramatic imagery, but the structure of the idea itself. These were not vague myths about chaos. They were orderly models of time. Creation did not lead to permanence, it led to repetition. Even in cultures without explicit numerical cycles, the same intuition appears. Ancient Greek thinkers spoke of recurring ages. Norse mythology envisioned a world destroyed by fire and ice, only to rise again from the sea. In China, dynastic cycles described the rise, corruption, collapse, and renewal of order as a natural law. These traditions differ in detail, but they converge on a single premise: history does not escape itself. From a modern scientific perspective, this worldview is often categorized as symbolic or religious. Yet it is worth noting that these cycles often align loosely with real environmental patterns. Ice ages advance and retreat. Sea levels rise and fall. Climate systems oscillate between stability and chaos. The Earth itself moves in cycles far older than humanity. If ancient cultures were responding to long-term environmental memory, events preserved not in data but in stories, then cyclical history may not be philosophy at all. It may be observation. This possibility reframes the flood narratives and lost ages in a subtle but profound way. They may not be exaggerations of isolated disasters. They may be cultural compression, vast spans of time reduced into narrative forms that could survive oral transmission. A single flood may represent centuries of rising seas. A single fire may represent a prolonged period of cosmic or volcanic instability. In this light, the idea of multiple civilizations becomes less radical. If humanity has faced repeated global disruptions, then each recovery would appear to its survivors as a beginning. Writing would start again. Kingship would be reasserted. Memory would shorten. The past would fade into myth. The cyclical model does not require a lost golden age filled with impossible technology. It only requires that progress is fragile and that collapse is thorough. A society does not need to reach modern levels of advancement to leave an enduring absence. It only needs to be organized enough to be remembered and destroyed enough to be forgotten. Ancient cultures seemed to accept this fragility as fundamental. They built monuments not for eternity, but for remembrance. They encoded warnings into myth. They counted ages not to celebrate them, but to acknowledge their end. The unsettling implication is not that ancient people knew more than we do. It is that they expected less. They did not assume continuity. They assumed interruption. And if history truly operates in cycles, then the question of how many civilizations have existed before us becomes secondary. The more pressing question is whether any civilization, no matter how advanced, has ever escaped the pattern. Because in a cyclical world, the end is not a failure of progress. It is part of the design. If civilizations rise and fall in cycles, then the next question is unavoidable. What forces are powerful enough to erase an entire world, not just once, but repeatedly? Ancient traditions offer an answer that is remarkably consistent. They do not speak of slow decline alone. They speak of resets, sudden, overwhelming disruptions that leave no room for recovery. These resets are described in different forms, but they tend to fall into three categories: fire, water, and ice. Water is the most familiar. Flood myths dominate ancient memory, from Mesopotamia to the Americas. Rising seas, endless rain, rivers breaking their boundaries. Water is relentless, patient, and thorough. It does not merely destroy structures. It dissolves foundations, carries settlements away, and buries landscapes beneath layers of sediment. Over time, it leaves behind a silence so complete that even the shape of the land is forgotten. Fire appears less frequently, but with greater intensity. In some traditions, it descends from the sky. In others, it rises from the earth itself. Ancient stories speak of worlds consumed by flame, skies that burn, and days when the sun grows hostile. To modern readers, these accounts sound symbolic, even fantastical. Yet science offers possibilities that ancient people could never have named. Asteroid impacts, massive volcanic eruptions, solar events capable of crippling entire ecosystems. Ice represents a slower, colder end. Not a single moment of destruction, but a prolonged suffocation. Expanding glaciers grind landscapes into dust. Growing cold shortens growing seasons, collapses food chains, and forces migrations that strain societies to their limits. Ice ages do not announce themselves dramatically. They erase through attrition, generation by generation, until what once thrived can no longer survive. What is striking is not that ancient people feared these forces, it is that they expected them. Their myths do not ask whether destruction will come, they ask when and in what form. Fire, water, or ice. One will eventually arrive. Modern science, working independently, has begun to uncover a history of Earth that feels uncomfortably compatible with this expectation. The planet has endured repeated mass extinctions. Climate systems have flipped abruptly. Sea levels have surged. The surface of the world has been reshaped again and again by forces beyond any civilization's control. Yet within academic frameworks, these events are often treated as isolated. A glaciation here, an impact there, a flood in one region. The ancient worldview, by contrast, connects them. It treats destruction as periodic, systemic, and inevitable. This difference matters. If catastrophes are rare and random, then civilization can plan around them. But if they are cyclical, then no amount of planning guarantees survival. Complexity itself becomes a liability. The more intricate a society grows, the more vulnerable it becomes to sudden disruption. Ancient cultures seem to understand this intuitively. Their stories do not glorify expansion. They warn against it. They suggest that every peak carries within it the conditions for collapse, not because of moral failure alone, but because the world itself does not remain stable. In this framework, resets are not punishments, they are corrections. The Earth does not negotiate with civilizations. It does not adapt to them. It simply continues its own cycles, indifferent to what has been built upon its surface. If earlier civilizations existed, they would not have needed to fail through war or internal decay. They could have been erased by forces no society could resist. Rising seas would have swallowed coastal centers. Ice would have driven survivors inland. Fire from the sky would have ended entire regions in moments. And after each reset, the pattern would repeat. Small groups endure, knowledge fragments. Memory fades. Eventually, civilization rises again, believing itself to be new. The question is not whether such resets can happen. The question is whether we are living between them. Ancient stories speak in symbols, but the Earth records its own history in layers of ice, stone, and sediment. Long before humans learned to write, the planet was already keeping a precise account of disruption and recovery. In recent decades, science has learned how to read these records, and what they reveal is unsettlingly familiar. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica preserve snapshots of ancient atmospheres, trapped bubble by bubble across hundreds of thousands of years. Within them, researchers can see sudden temperature shifts, sharp rises and falls that occur not over millennia, but over decades, sometimes even years. These are not gentle transitions. They are abrupt reversals, moments when the climate system appears to flip into a new state almost without warning. One such period stands out. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, the planet began to warm. Glaciers retreated, sea levels rose, conditions improved, and then abruptly the process reversed. Temperatures plunged back into near glacial conditions in an event now known as the Younger Dryas. For more than 1,000 years, the Earth cooled again before resuming its warming trend just as suddenly as it had stopped. To the people living through it, this would not have felt like a climatic fluctuation. It would have felt like the world turning hostile. Ecosystems collapsed, food sources shifted or vanished. Human groups that had begun to settle and organize were forced back into survival mode. Whatever progress had been made was interrupted, if not erased entirely. The cause of the Younger Dryas is still debated. Some researchers point to massive freshwater releases into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents. Others suggest cosmic impacts or atmospheric disturbances. What matters is not the mechanism alone, but the effect, a rapid, global reset of environmental conditions. Sea levels tell a similar story. As ice sheets melted, oceans rose more than 100 meters, flooding vast coastal plains. These were not marginal lands. They were some of the most fertile and resource-rich environments on the planet. If early societies had formed there, as logic suggests they would have, then their disappearance would have been nearly total. Their cities would now lie far beyond the reach of casual discovery, buried beneath water and sediment. Geology also records moments of sudden destruction from above. Impact craters, layers of unusual minerals, and global burn marks suggest that Earth has experienced repeated encounters with cosmic debris. Most were not extinction-level events, but they did not need to be. A single, large impact could devastate a region, alter climate patterns, and destabilize societies already operating near their limits. Volcanism adds another layer of uncertainty. Super-eruptions have occurred in the past, ejecting ash that darkened skies across continents. Crops failed. Temperatures dropped. Human populations were reduced to bottlenecks. Survival, not progress, became the priority. Taken individually, these events are studied as separate phenomena, but when viewed together, a pattern emerges. The Earth is not a stable platform upon which civilization steadily advances. It is a dynamic system, capable of rapid and profound change. Periods of relative calm are punctuated by episodes of upheaval that reset the conditions for life. Ancient cultures did not possess ice cores or satellite data, but they lived closer to these thresholds. They observed change directly, across generations. They encoded what they saw into stories that could survive when structures could not. Fire, water, and ice were not metaphors. They were forces that had already demonstrated their power. If civilizations existed before ours, they would not need to have been destroyed by a single dramatic event. A sequence of shocks, a cooling here, a flood there, a collapse of food systems, would have been enough. Over time, even memory would erode, leaving behind only fragments, myths, anomalous records, and an uneasy sense that something had ended before. The Earth does not announce its resets in advance. It offers no timeline, no warning tailored to human ambition. It simply shifts, as it always has. And in that reality, the idea of repeated civilizations no longer sounds extraordinary. It sounds expected. In the late 20th century, archaeology encountered a problem it was not prepared for. High on a limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, a series of stone pillars emerged from the soil, massive, carefully carved, and unmistakably intentional. The site would come to be known as Göbekli Tepe. What made it extraordinary was not its size or craftsmanship alone, but its age. Radiocarbon dating placed the earliest structures at more than 12,000 years old. This was not a marginal adjustment to existing timelines. It was a rupture. According to conventional models, humanity at this time consisted of small groups of hunter-gatherers living nomadically with no agriculture, no pottery, and no permanent architecture. Monumental construction was not supposed to exist yet. And yet, here it was. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe weigh several tons each. They are arranged in deliberate circular enclosures. Many are carved with reliefs of animals, lions, snakes, birds, and insects, rendered with a sophistication that implies long artistic tradition. This was not an experiment. It was the product of knowledge already refined. Equally unsettling is what is missing. There is no evidence of domestic life at the site, no hearths, no storage pits, no signs of long-term habitation. Göbekli Tepe does not appear to have been a village or a city. It was something else entirely. To build it, large numbers of people would have needed to cooperate over extended periods. Stone had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and erected with precision. This required planning, coordination, and social organization far beyond what was previously attributed to hunter-gatherer societies. In response, archaeology adjusted its narrative. Perhaps, it was suggested, complex ritual spaces came before agriculture. Maybe belief systems and social cohesion motivated people to settle and farm, rather than the other way around. This reinterpretation preserved the overall framework of human development while absorbing the anomaly. But Göbekli Tepe raises questions that extend beyond sequencing. Why would a society without permanent settlements invest such immense effort into a site they did not live in? Why build something so durable only to abandon it? And perhaps most strangely of all, why deliberately bury it? At some point, the enclosures of Göbekli Tepe were carefully filled in with rubble and soil. This was not the result of natural collapse. It was intentional. The site was entombed by those who built it, preserved rather than destroyed. This act suggests foresight, an awareness that the world was changing, that something was ending. Some researchers argue that Göbekli Tepe represents a cultural response to instability at the end of the Ice Age, a place where communities gathered to reaffirm identity as environments shifted around them. That explanation is plausible. Yet it does not fully account for the scale, precision, or symbolism of the site. Göbekli Tepe does not feel like the beginning of something tentative. It feels like the remnant of something already mature. A tradition carried forward, briefly, before being sealed away. If this site existed 12,000 years ago, then the roots of organized human culture stretch deeper than previously assumed. And if such a structure could be built without agriculture, then the standard sequence of civilization, farming first, monuments later, begins to unravel. Göbekli Tepe does not tell us who we were. It tells us that we have forgotten far more than we remember. Once Göbekli Tepe entered the archaeological record, it became impossible to ignore a deeper implication. The site did not merely challenge dates. It challenged assumptions about who ancient humans were and what they were capable of. The people who constructed these monuments do not fit comfortably into any existing category. They are labeled hunter-gatherers because no clear evidence of agriculture has been found. Yet nothing about Göbekli Tepe suggests a simple or temporary society. The precision of the carvings, the symmetry of the enclosures, and the symbolic coherence of the imagery all point to long-established traditions. Skills like these are not developed spontaneously. They are taught, refined, and transmitted over generations. This raises an uncomfortable question. If these people were not farmers and they did not live at the site, how were they organized? Seasonal gathering alone struggles to explain the sustained labor required. Hundreds of individuals would have needed to cooperate, share resources, and follow a common purpose. Such coordination implies leadership, planning, and social structure. Equally puzzling is the iconography. The animals carved into the pillars are not random. Certain creatures repeat across enclosures. Some are dangerous. Some are scavengers. Some are associated with death or transformation in later mythologies. The figures appear to be arranged intentionally, as if telling a story or encoding meaning. Yet there is no accompanying text, no obvious narrative to guide interpretation. This suggests that the builders shared a symbolic language already understood among them, a system of meaning that did not require explanation because it was familiar. In other words, a culture with depth. Then there is the act of burial. At some point, the enclosures were deliberately filled in. The pillars were not toppled in violence. They were carefully covered, layer by layer, preserving their form. This was not abandonment through collapse. It was closure. Why would a society expend enormous effort to build something only to hide it? One possibility is ritual. Another is protection. A third is remembrance. The builders may have believed the site had fulfilled its purpose, or they may have been responding to forces beyond their control, environmental change, social disruption, or the loss of the knowledge required to maintain what they had created. Some researchers have suggested that Göbekli Tepe represents a bridge between worlds, a remnant of a culture transitioning from one way of life to another. Others propose it is the last echo of something older, a tradition carried forward after a collapse, briefly resurfacing before disappearing again. None of these interpretations can be proven. What can be said with certainty is that Göbekli Tepe does not behave like an origin point. Origins are messy. They show experimentation, variation, and gradual improvement. Göbekli Tepe appears fully formed. If civilization truly began here, it did so already knowing what it was doing. This aligns uncomfortably well with the ancient idea of cycles. After a reset, survivors do not start from zero. They start from fragments, from memory, from practices that no longer have a clear origin. Göbekli Tepe may be one such fragment, not evidence of a global lost civilization, but of something that survived long enough to leave a mark and then vanished again. A structure standing at the edge of memory, neither fully explained nor entirely isolated. If that is the case, then Göbekli Tepe is not alone. It is a warning that other anomalies may exist, buried deeper, older, and more difficult to interpret. That what we call prehistory may be less empty than it appears. And if monuments like this can exist at the threshold of known history, then the line separating myth from memory becomes dangerously thin. Göbekli Tepe does not demand belief in lost worlds. It merely reminds us that the past has not finished revealing itself. When anomalies appear in the archaeological record, science does not ignore them. It absorbs them, categorizes them, and attempts to place them within existing frameworks. This is not resistance born of denial, but of caution. Established models are built slowly, tested repeatedly, and supported by vast bodies of evidence. To abandon them lightly would be irresponsible. And yet, history shows that the greatest shifts in understanding often begin as inconveniences. From the perspective of mainstream archaeology, claims of lost civilizations and forgotten ages trigger understandable concern. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Stories of floods, long-lived kings, and vanished worlds are treated as mythological language, symbolic narratives shaped by human psychology, fear, and imagination. In this view, ancient people were not recording events. They were encoding meaning. Floods become metaphors for chaos. Long rains become symbols of divine favor. Cycles become philosophical reflections on morality and decay. The past is flattened into allegory, safely separated from literal interpretation. This approach offers comfort. It preserves a clear, linear timeline. It protects the idea that civilization arose once, gradually, and progressed, however unevenly, toward the present. Within this framework, anomalies are not threats. They are misunderstandings. Göbekli Tepe, then, becomes an outlier, not a turning point. The Sumerian King List becomes a mythological preface, not a historical memory. Flood stories become universal fears of water, not recollections of shared catastrophe. Each puzzle is solved in isolation, contained within the boundaries of accepted theory. But containment
has limits.
As more discoveries accumulate, the effort required to keep them separate grows. Sites appear earlier than expected, technologies emerge without clear developmental pathways, structures are found that seem unnecessary for the societies attributed to them. Each can be explained individually. Together they begin to form a pattern. Scientific caution is essential, but so is scientific humility. The archaeological record is not complete. It is fragmentary, biased toward what survives. Organic materials decay. Coastal sites drown. Entire regions remain unexplored. What we see is not the past itself, but what the past has allowed us to find. This reality creates tension. On one side is the demand for rigorous evidence. On the other is the growing awareness that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when dealing with deep time and catastrophic loss.
Some researchers quietly acknowledge this gap. They accept that current models may underestimate the age and complexity of human organization. They point out that archaeology has been wrong before. Civilizations once thought impossible at certain dates are now firmly established. The timeline has already been pushed back more than once. Yet there is a line most are unwilling to cross. The idea of multiple advanced civilizations rising and falling before recorded history challenges not just data, but narrative. It threatens the simplicity of origins. It complicates the story of progress. And so, the debate continues, often framed not as a question of evidence, but of interpretation. How much uncertainty is acceptable? When does skepticism become rigidity? And at what point does protecting a model prevent us from seeing what lies beyond it? Science advances by questioning assumptions, but it also depends on them. The balance between openness and restraint is delicate. Too much speculation undermines credibility. Too much caution risks stagnation. The resistance, then, is not to mystery itself, but to what mystery implies. That the past may be less orderly than we prefer, that beginnings may not be singular, and that humanity's story may include chapters that were not meant to survive. The question is not whether science is wrong. The question is whether it is finished listening. Despite the caution of mainstream interpretation, certain anomalies persist with an uncomfortable consistency. They do not vanish when examined. They do not dissolve under closer scrutiny. Instead, they remain, awkward pieces that never quite fit the puzzle as it is currently arranged. One such anomaly is timing. Again and again, archaeological discoveries appear earlier than expected. Settlements, tools, and symbolic behavior emerge thousands of years before they are supposed to. Each time, the response is adjustment, not reconsideration. The timeline is extended slightly, the anomaly is absorbed, and the larger structure remains intact. But this process has limits. When dates are pushed back repeatedly, the question is no longer whether the timeline needs refinement, but whether its underlying assumptions are correct. If humans were capable of complex organization earlier than believed, then the absence of evidence for even earlier complexity becomes harder to justify, especially when environmental conditions suggest that much of that evidence would now be inaccessible. Another anomaly lies in technological discontinuity. In many regions, sophisticated techniques appear abruptly, without clear developmental precursors. Precision stonework, advanced astronomical alignments, and large-scale construction sometimes emerge as if from nowhere. The usual explanation is convergence, that humans independently arrived at similar solutions. This is plausible, but convergence does not explain why these solutions often appear fully formed, rather than evolving gradually through visible intermediate stages. Then there is the problem of loss. Archaeology is skilled at tracing development, but far less comfortable with disappearance. Civilizations collapse, but they rarely vanish completely. Knowledge tends to persist in some form, copied, adapted, or remembered. Yet ancient traditions insist that entire ages were erased so thoroughly
that only fragments remained. This level of loss is difficult to reconcile with the idea of steady progress. Critics of alternative interpretations often point out that no unmistakable artifacts of advanced ancient technology have been found. No machines, no alloys out of place, no clear evidence of global infrastructure. This is a fair objection, but it assumes that advanced civilizations must resemble our own. It assumes similar materials, similar priorities, similar vulnerabilities. If earlier societies were advanced in ways different from us, socially, astronomically, architecturally, rather than industrially, their material footprint might be subtle. And if their centers were coastal, their destruction would have been especially complete. Modern cities built along shorelines would leave little trace after 10,000 years underwater. Stone would erode, metals would corrode, plastics would fragment into dust. The past may not be hiding its secrets maliciously. It may simply be obeying the laws of time. Within academic circles, these issues are increasingly acknowledged, though often cautiously. Papers explore pre-agricultural complexity. Conferences debate the pace of human development. The idea that hunter-gatherers were incapable of large-scale organization is no longer universally accepted. The door has opened, even if only slightly. What remains controversial is not the evidence itself, but the implication. That civilization may not be a singular event, that it may have emerged, collapsed, and re-emerged under different conditions. That what we call the first civilization may only be the first one we remember clearly. Science resists such implications not out of fear, but out of discipline. The burden of proof is high, and rightly so. But history shows that paradigms shift not when all questions are answered, but when enough anomalies accumulate to make the old explanations feel strained. The question, then, is not whether the idea of earlier civilizations is true. The question is whether our current framework is flexible enough to recognize it if it is. Because anomalies do not disappear when ignored. They wait, and over time they begin to speak to one another. When civilizations collapse, they do not disappear evenly. Buildings fall, populations scatter, institutions fail, but knowledge behaves differently. Some forms vanish almost immediately, while others endure, often in distorted or fragmentary form. This uneven survival raises a question that ancient cultures seem to ask instinctively, and modern society rarely does. What kind of knowledge lasts when the world that produced it no longer exists? Tools made of wood decay. Metals corrode. Entire cities can be erased by water, ice, or time. But ideas, especially those encoded in numbers, patterns, and stories, can persist far longer. They move from place to place, from generation to generation, changing shape as they go. In this way, knowledge can outlive the civilization that created it, even when its original context is forgotten. Ancient traditions appear to reflect this understanding. Again and again, they speak not of inventing wisdom, but of receiving it. Egyptian texts describe sacred knowledge handed down from an earlier age. Mesopotamian scribes copied lists, tables, and formulas they did not claim to have created. In India, the Vedas were not authored, but heard, preserved through memorization across centuries before being written down. This framing is easy to dismiss as cultural humility or religious convention, but it may also reflect a deeper intuition, that the most important knowledge was inherited, not discovered anew. Mathematics offers a revealing example. Certain mathematical relationships appear with surprising sophistication at the dawn of recorded history. Geometric ratios, astronomical cycles, and complex calendars emerge with little evidence of gradual development. They appear not as tentative experiments, but as established systems already in use. Astronomy tells a similar story. Ancient cultures tracked celestial movements with remarkable precision, aligning monuments to solstices, equinoxes, and stellar events that unfold over thousands of years. Such observations require long-term record-keeping, They require patience, continuity, and stability across generations. And yet, in many cases, these systems appear suddenly in the archaeological record, without clear predecessors. If this knowledge was developed slowly, where are the intermediate stages? Where are the failed attempts, the approximations, the visible learning curve? In some cases, they exist. In others, they do not. What remains instead are finished frameworks, treated as traditional rather than experimental. One possibility is that this knowledge was reinvented multiple times. Humanity, after all, is capable of rediscovery. But ancient cultures often insisted that they were not rediscovering anything. They were preserving it, protecting it from loss. This idea is woven subtly into myths of survival. Flood stories frequently include instructions to save not just people and animals, but measurements, laws, and sacred formulas. The goal is not merely biological continuity, but cultural continuity. Memory itself becomes something worth rescuing. If civilizations before ours did exist, they would not need to pass down machines or monuments to leave a legacy. Those would be the first things to vanish. What might survive instead are abstractions, numbers, alignments, proportions, reduced to symbols and stories simple enough to endure catastrophe. Over time, the origin of these ideas would fade. Later cultures would use them without fully understanding where they came from. Knowledge would persist, but its history would not. This is the core of the lost knowledge hypothesis. Not that ancient people possessed technology identical to ours, but that they may have understood aspects of the world, astronomical, mathematical, environmental, with a depth that later societies inherited only in fragments. Fragments are easy to underestimate. Separated from their original context, they look like coincidences, myths, or symbolic gestures. But when examined together, they suggest continuity across rupture. A thread running through collapsed ages, barely visible, but unbroken. If this hypothesis is wrong, then ancient humanity repeatedly arrived at the same insights independently across vast spans of time and space. If it is right, then civilization is not built once, but many times, each new world standing unknowingly on the shoulders of the last. The unsettling possibility is not that we have lost knowledge before. It is that we may be living on what remains of it. If knowledge can survive collapse, then the traces of earlier worlds would not announce themselves clearly. They would not appear as intact systems or complete explanations. They would appear as echoes, partial, displaced, and often misunderstood. This is precisely how much ancient knowledge presents itself today. Consider architecture. Across the ancient world, monumental structures appear that demand a level of planning and precision difficult to reconcile with the societies to which they are assigned. Massive stone blocks are quarried, transported, and fitted together with tolerances so fine that even modern tools struggle to replicate them. These constructions are often attributed to ingenuity and labor alone, and in many cases that explanation is sufficient. But the question is not whether ancient people were capable. It is whether the knowledge required emerged independently, each time, without inheritance. Proportions offer a quieter clue. Certain mathematical relationships recur across cultures that had no known contact. Ratios embedded in pyramids, temples, and ceremonial layouts reflect geometric principles that are not obvious without prior abstraction. These principles are applied consistently, as if they were standard practice rather than experimental discovery. The builders do not appear to be testing ideas. They appear to be following. Astronomical alignment deepens the puzzle. Many ancient monuments are oriented not only to the sun, but to stellar positions that change slowly over time due to precession. To account for these movements requires observation across centuries, even millennia. Such timescales exceed the lifespan of individual builders and rulers. They imply institutional memory, systems of knowledge maintained beyond any single generation. Yet in many cases, the cultures that inherited these alignments could no longer fully explain them. Ritual preserved function, but not understanding. The structure remained meaningful, but its original purpose became symbolic rather than technical. Knowledge survived, but it had thinned. This thinning is what lost knowledge looks like. Not a clean break, but a gradual erosion of context. Later societies use inherited tools without knowing who first shaped them. Over time, utility becomes tradition, tradition becomes myth, and myth becomes dismissal. Ancient texts occasionally hint at this process. They speak of first times when gods or ancestors taught humanity how to measure the heavens, divide land, or build in harmony with cosmic order. These accounts are often dismissed as religious imagination, but they may also reflect an intuitive truth that certain forms of knowledge felt older than the societies using them. If civilizations rose and fell before ours, they would not leave behind instruction manuals. They would leave behind habits, preferred measurements, sacred numbers, ways of orienting space. These habits could persist long after their origin was forgotten, passed down because they worked, not because they were understood. Over thousands of years, the distinction between invention and inheritance would blur. Each generation would assume it was building anew, unaware that it was repeating patterns laid down long before. What survived would seem timeless, even inevitable. The danger in this idea is not that it challenges modern confidence, it is that it reveals how fragile continuity truly is. Knowledge does not accumulate automatically. It must be maintained, contextualized, and protected. When those systems fail, even advanced understanding can collapse into fragments that appear primitive to later eyes. If we are indeed part of a recurring pattern, then our own knowledge is not immune. We preserve data digitally, assuming permanence. But formats decay. Systems fail. Context is lost faster than information itself. Without continuity, complexity becomes noise. The lost knowledge hypothesis does not claim certainty. It offers a lens. Through it, ancient anomalies no longer appear as isolated curiosities. They appear as residues, survivals from worlds that ended without leaving a clear signature. If that lens is correct, then history is not a story of steady ascent. It is a story of forgetting. And forgetting, once begun, is far easier than rebuilding what was lost. Once the idea of cycles is allowed, a new and unsettling question emerges naturally. If civilizations rise, collapse, and rise again, then where exactly do we stand within that sequence? Are we truly unique, or merely the latest iteration in a long pattern of beginnings and endings? Ancient cultures occasionally attempted to answer this question themselves, not with precision, but with structure. They counted ages, they named worlds, they described successive creations, each one distinct, each one ending in catastrophe. The Aztecs spoke of multiple suns. Hindu tradition described repeating yuga cycles. Other mythologies hinted at worlds before the present one, now lost beneath fire, water, or darkness. These counts were never presented as speculation. They were presented as memory. Modern scholars often interpret these numbers symbolically, and they may well be, but symbolism does not emerge without reason. Numbers organize experience. They impose order on chaos. When ancient cultures counted worlds, they were doing more than telling stories. They were placing themselves within a sequence they believed already existed. The idea that we might be the seventh civilization is not derived from a single ancient source. It is a synthesis, a pattern drawn from overlapping traditions that describe multiple resets, each one leaving behind survivors and fragments. The exact number is less important than the implication that humanity has done this before. If earlier civilizations existed, they would not all have looked the same. Each would have developed under different environmental conditions, with different resources, challenges, and priorities. Some may have remained regional, others may have spread widely. Some may have endured for thousands of years, others may have vanished quickly. What they would share is vulnerability. Each civilization, no matter how advanced, would have faced forces beyond its control. Climate shifts, rising seas, volcanic winters, impacts from space. These are not hypothetical threats. They are documented realities of Earth's past, and none of them care how advanced a society believes itself to be. If 6 civilizations existed before ours, their absence does not require conspiracy or erasure. Time alone is sufficient. 10,000 years is enough to erase almost everything that is not deliberately preserved. 100,000 years is enough to turn certainty into speculation. After several cycles, even memory itself would fracture. What remains are impressions, myths of earlier ages, stories of decline, records that do not quite fit, structures that appear too early, or knowledge that seems to arrive too suddenly. These are not proofs. They are symptoms. The modern world tends to resist this framing because it undermines a core belief that we are progressing towards something permanent, that our technologies, institutions, and archives guarantee continuity. But ancient cultures did not share this confidence. They expected endings. They prepared for them psychologically, if not practically. If we are the 7th civilization, then the number itself is not a badge of achievement. It is a warning. 6 times before, complexity gave way to simplicity. 6 times before, knowledge narrowed. 6 times before, humanity had to begin again, believing itself to be new. The most uncomfortable possibility is not that we are repeating history. It is that repetition feels invisible from the inside. If civilizations have risen and fallen before, then their final moments would not have looked dramatic from within. Collapse is rarely experienced as an ending. It is experienced as a series of manageable problems. A drought here, a conflict there, a technological fix just out of reach but surely coming soon. From the inside, decline feels temporary. This is perhaps the most unsettling parallel between ancient cycles and the modern world. The patterns described in old traditions do not begin with catastrophe. They begin with confidence. In many ancient narratives, the final age before destruction is marked by extraordinary capability. Humanity is skilled, organized, and productive. Knowledge is widespread. Construction flourishes. The world feels mastered. And precisely at this moment, vulnerability is greatest. The reason is not moral failure alone, though ancient stories often frame it that way. The reason is structural. Complex systems are efficient but fragile. They depend on stability. They require predictable climates, reliable resources, and uninterrupted chains of knowledge. When any one of these falters, cascading failure becomes possible. Archaeology shows this pattern repeatedly in known civilizations. The Maya did not disappear overnight. They experienced droughts, political fragmentation, and agricultural stress. The Roman Empire did not fall in a single year. It stretched itself thin, relying on systems that could no longer sustain the scale they had achieved. In each case, collapse followed peak complexity, not simplicity. Ancient myths extend this pattern beyond individual societies to humanity itself. Each age ends not when people are weak, but when they believe they are secure. The reset comes not at the bottom, but at the height. This is where the modern world begins to look uncomfortably familiar. Global civilization is more interconnected than any before it. Supply chains span continents. Technologies rely on layers of infrastructure few fully understand. Knowledge is vast, but specialization means no one holds it all. We have become efficient and interdependent. Like the civilizations of old, we have placed our faith in continuity. Data is archived. Systems are backed up. Redundancy is assumed to guarantee survival. Yet much of this confidence depends on electricity, networks, and stable environments. Remove any one of these, and the illusion of permanence weakens quickly. Ancient cultures warned that endings come not as judgments, but as consequences. When systems grow too intricate, they lose resilience. When expansion outpaces adaptation, collapse becomes a question of timing, not possibility. If we are the seventh civilization, then our situation is not exceptional. It is familiar. We are doing what civilizations do, building outward, trusting forward motion, assuming that solutions will arrive before limits are reached. The difference is scale. Previous collapses were regional, even when remembered as global. Our systems are planetary. Our vulnerabilities are shared. A disruption today does not remain local. It propagates. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. Ancient cycles were not predictions. They were warnings shaped by experience. They did not claim that destruction must come, only that it has come before, repeatedly, when confidence outpaced caution. The most dangerous assumption is not that we are advanced. It is that advancement alone is enough. If history is cyclical, then the question is not whether we are the seventh civilization. The question is whether we will be remembered as the last phase before another silence, and whether, when that silence arrives, anything of us will remain, clear enough to be understood, or only as fragments that future cultures will argue over, long after our certainty has faded. Every civilization tells a story about itself. It speaks of origins, struggles, triumphs, and hopes for continuity. Rarely does it imagine its own disappearance. Endings belong to the past, to others, to lessons learned safely from a distance. Yet when ancient cultures looked backward, what they saw most clearly were not beginnings, but absences. The further into the past they looked, the less solid history became. Names blurred, timelines shortened, whole ages collapsed into a single sentence. Something had been there. Now it was not. That absence became the most powerful presence in their memory. This is where the idea of a final silence begins to take shape. Not a dramatic apocalypse, not a sudden extinction, but a quiet erasure. Records stop. Monuments decay. Knowledge fragments until it no longer resembles itself. What remains is not truth, but interpretation. If we are living within a cycle, then silence is not the end of humanity. It is the end of coherence. Survivors continue, life goes on, but the shared understanding of what once existed dissolves. Later generations rebuild without knowing exactly what they are rebuilding from. They inherit tools, stories, and symbols, but not the full context that once gave them meaning. Ancient traditions seem to anticipate this outcome. They do not describe total annihilation. They describe forgetting. They warn that memory is more fragile than stone, and that continuity depends not on power, but on transmission. When that transmission fails, even the most advanced civilization can become invisible to its descendants. Modern society places enormous faith in preservation. Digital archives store unimaginable quantities of information. Satellites record every corner of the planet. Knowledge feels permanent because it is abundant, yet abundance can be deceptive. Data without context becomes noise. Records without interpreters become artifacts. Technology without infrastructure becomes useless. The silence ancient cultures feared was not caused by ignorance. It was caused by interruption. A flood does not need to erase every city. It only needs to sever the chain long enough for skills to be lost. A climate shift does not need to kill everyone. It only needs to disrupt systems faster than they can adapt. Over time, the result is the same. The world continues, but the story resets. This is why ancient myths rarely end with certainty. They close with ambiguity, with warnings, with reminders that the present world is temporary. They do not offer solutions. They offer perspective. The idea that we might be the seventh civilization is not meant to inspire fear. It is meant to inspire humility, to remind us that intelligence does not guarantee endurance, and that complexity does not equal permanence. Every civilization believes it has solved the problem of survival. History suggests otherwise. What ancient cultures understood, perhaps better than we do, is that silence is not dramatic. It arrives slowly, disguised as normality. Systems strain, knowledge narrows, memory shortens, and by the time the break is visible, it has already happened. If there is a lesson buried within the idea of cycles, it is not about avoiding collapse at all costs. It is about recognizing fragility while there is still time to act differently, to value continuity over expansion, memory over dominance, understanding over confidence. The final silence is not inevitable, but it has come before. At the end of every ancient cycle, there is no declaration, no inscription announcing that a civilization has failed, no final monument acknowledging defeat. There is only a gradual thinning of presence, fewer records, simpler structures. Stories that once carried detail begin to repeat themselves without explanation. Meaning survives longer than memory, but even meaning fades. This is how civilizations truly end, not with collapse alone, but with incomprehension. Those who come after do not see a fallen world, they see a blank one. They walk across landscapes that once held cities and assume nothing important ever stood there. They inherit myths without knowing they are fragments of history. They rebuild, believing they are the first. Ancient cultures seemed deeply aware of this danger. They feared not death, but forgetting. Their greatest anxiety was not extinction, but repetition without awareness. This is why their myths linger on cycles rather than endings, why they warn of ages that rise and fall rather than timelines that progress endlessly forward. The hypothesis that we are the seventh civilization does not ask us to believe in a specific number. It asks us to confront a pattern, that humanity, when it reaches a certain level of complexity, begins to forget how fragile its position truly is, that mastery of environment leads to dependence on stability, and that stability, historically, has never lasted. If 6 civilizations existed before ours, their greatest failure may not have been technological or moral. It may have been narrative. They may have believed, as we often do, that their world was fundamentally different from those that came before, that they had escaped the cycle, that collapse belonged to myth. The evidence we have examined does not prove that they were wrong. It also does not prove that they were right. What it reveals instead is uncertainty, deep, persistent, and unresolved. Written into ancient texts, encoded in myths, implied by archaeological anomalies, reflected in the planet's own history of disruption. Science has not closed this question, and perhaps it never will. The farther back we look, the more incomplete the record becomes. Time favors erosion over preservation. What survives does so unevenly, leaving gaps that cannot be filled with certainty. And yet, those gaps matter. They remind us that our story is not as complete as we assume, that the confidence of the present is not evidence of permanence, that civilization, no matter how advanced, exists within limits it does not control. If we are the 7th civilization, then the most important question is not what destroyed the 6 before us. It is what they failed to carry forward. What knowledge was lost? What warnings were ignored? What assumptions proved fatal? And if we are not the 7th, if this idea is only a reflection of ancient fears, then it still serves a purpose. It forces us to look at our world not as an endpoint, but as a phase, a moment within a much longer human story. The past does not speak clearly. It whispers, through broken lists of kings, through buried monuments, through stories of floods and fire and ice. It does not tell us what will happen next. It only reminds us that something always does. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is not that civilizations end. It is that they end believing they have finally escaped history.
And if that is the case, then the silence that follows is not a punishment. It is a forgetting, one that waits patiently until the next civilization begins to ask the same questions all over again.